Well, I'm joined in the studio by the news analyst, Dr. Warwick Onyeama, and the social commentator, Dorcas Gwata. And Dorcas, of course, wants tomorrow's massive Nigerian population, deal with corruption, fuel scarcity, unemployment, and of course the security threat of Boko Haram. Let's talk about that fuel strike first. It may be over, but the crisis it spawned may not easily be remedied. And it's of course a crisis now inherited by Mr. Buhari.
It certainly is, Charles. But before we go into the oil situation, I really want to put some context into this. The days that we're facing today, the sense of hope that we're seeing in Nigerians reminds me hugely of when Barack Obama came into power. This whole sense of this man will come into power. He took over from George Bush, where people were very happy. Jonathan Goodman is the same. And this whole national sense of everything will be okay was very evident. I've seen the same in the Nigerian diaspora. I saw the same when Buhari came to Chatham House. That was very, very evident. The stakes are high here. The bar is very high. Expectations are high. His in-tray is very full. Can he deliver? He has a challenge, and he's taking over from huge. It's not diversified. It just hasn't diversified itself. It can, and it has. So he's got some challenges there. He needs to win over. He needs to translate his words into development. Can that roll out into development? We'll have to see.
That's a key point, Warwick. What do you think the main economic priority of the new president should be? Should he, for instance, tear down, as Dorcas was hinting there, the dysfunctional oil-based economy and rebuild it from the bottom up? If so, how should he set about doing that?
Well, that's going to take some time. I mean, that's not going to be done overnight. It is an entrenched dysfunctionality in the oil economy as it's structured now. And he will have to deal with that, but I think there'll be more immediate things like, what do you do with an economy that is now based on an oil price that is rock bottom? How do you reclaim the money that you're going to lose as a result of the fall in price?
That's a good point, and there have been suggestions that a way to do that, Dorcas, would be to, of course, diversify the economy as you suggested. You can't wave a magic wand and diversify, but you can certainly focus on things that have already started the diversification process, like agriculture, for example. There have also been suggestions that not only should the new president dismantle the dysfunctional National Oil Company, NNPC, but Nigeria should consider cutting back its crude oil exports to between 30 and 50% of production, and if necessary, leave OPEC. Do you agree with those who say that this should be a national priority?
Do you know, I think in the end, he needs to look at how he's going to produce some tax revenues from this system. This is a big market system.
So reform the tax system.
Absolutely. He very much
And that's a very good point, because most Nigerians don't pay tax.
Absolutely.
They don't pay taxes
in Africa,
at all.
right across the board, they've got in economies which are unaccounted for. And we see a very big middle class growing up in Nigeria. He touched very crucially here when he was in Chatham House on corruption. And he set the bar very high. I would say too high, because corruption, I think, is bigger than one man sometimes in Africa. Because those governance systems, but also acknowledges his limitations. He hasn't really acknowledged his limitations. That's because he wants the voters on his side. But yeah, those mechanisms need to be put together. Ultimately, we need to have some tax revenue so we can collect taxes.
So in addition to looking at corruption, Warwick, which is a critical thing, and he's emphasized it over and over again, he's got to close those gaps, those loopholes. It needs a diversified, export-oriented economy with a robust domestic manufacturing base, and instead of looking to OPEC, which is full of lazy, commodity-driven countries, perhaps he should be looking to economies like the BRICS, countries like Singapore, India, and Malaysia. Singapore, for example, that went from nothing.
I know. It has been very much the commodity-based model that you described for OPEC. We've just got to change that model. Now, the interesting thing is, what he might need to do, or his advisors might need to do, is look at the steps that Malaysia and Singapore took to overcome the backwardness of their economies to the present premier position that they now occupy. They're totally economically independent and have useful trade that benefits them. You see, Nigeria hasn't got that at the moment, and we need to get there.
Dorcas, you've been a big enthusiast of, I mean, you're very enthusiastic over sort of Buhari taking over, like many Nigerians. But do you think Nigerians will now be markedly less effusive in their enthusiasm for Mr. Buhari and his APC party now that he's moved to downplay expectations? Because, of course, the president-elect has already distanced himself from the promises made in his campaign manifesto during the elections.
I think the whole Nigerian diaspora is very, very nervous because they're waiting to see. This is a mark, this reflects on them. This is a proud people who are extremely proud, and also very proud of the fact that the elections were held so peacefully. And we must credit that across Africa, Charles, where we're seeing disruptions around Burundi, for instance. But they're taking a lot of pride from the fact that this man is coming in. Expectations are high. Yes, they're nervous about whether he can deliver. And this is the test. They're not just testing. The test is not just about Buhari. The test is on Nigeria. Can we deliver on this? We want to deliver, and we can deliver, but can we carry through? So, yeah, the atmosphere is absolutely one of tense, but also one of excitement.
But, of course,
just so excited.
Absolutely. Warwick, it's not just the Nigerians. I mean, we understand that 50 heads of state are arriving in Nigeria. Many of them are actually beginning to arrive now. Everybody watching Buhari keenly, and perhaps a little bit of nervousness if they begin to detect a shift in rhetoric.
Well, I don't think they're going to notice that tomorrow at the installation. I think if there's a shift in rhetoric, it'll probably follow over the next few months.
Yes, well, absolutely. But that is the point, isn't it? That everybody's going to be watching him keenly. Everything isn't going to happen tomorrow.
Well,
tomorrow will be the pomp, the circumstance, the pageantry.
And what they call the knacking of silverware on the teeth.
The problem, of course, is that Buhari is not big for all these kind of big public events. He's probably going to be squirming in his seat, isn't he?
To his credit, he's not a pompous man, and he isn't given over to the sort of grandiosity that's much loved by African presidents.
And, of course, Dorcas, meanwhile, dozens of people killed in new assaults by Boko Haram in Borno State. So Boko Haram down, not out, merely melting away to turn up to fight another day. And that will, of course, now be Mr. Buhari's headache.
It will be. Let's credit the Nigerian government here. Let's credit the region for settling down this huge conflict. But listen, we were talking about the economy earlier on. The reason why the economy is perhaps down was investors' confidence in Nigeria has been very, very low. You cannot invest in a country, even if you're investing in the south where Boko Haram is not really relevant. Investors can get very, very nervous. So by calming down the Boko Haram situation, is increasing, somewhat going to increase investors' confidence. So it has ripple effects in many, many angles. It's great to see that progress. But that's a very volatile and still a very, very fragile situation. He's got to carry it through. My real thinking is that Buhari has to win over the voters that he didn't carry through in the south. He's a northerner. He's a Muslim. There will be those who are very nervous about the fact that he's coming to power. What about us? Who's going to represent us? He needs to carry that through.
So there's got to be reconciliation for a
Absolutely.
start. But Warwick, I'm going to ask you this then, because we know, for example, that Goodluck Jonathan, who is a southerner, has done this rather dignified thing of taking President Buhari around the presidential villa, giving him a tour of it, like this is where the loos are and this is where you can sort of go and get a bit of nosh late at night sort of thing, which is really quite dignified, wasn't it, given the fact that, Jonathan's been under a lot of flack and been compared to sort of Buhari being the savior, Jonathan being the spoiler.
I think that's the fate of all expiring presidents. Certainly he's attracted a lot of, I think, perhaps unfairly negative evaluation of his period in office. But I think showing Buhari around what will probably feel like a torture chamber over the next year or so was probably the least he could do for his successor.
And of course, you were talking about Boko Haram there, Dorcas. The commanders and the top brass of the army can probably expect to be fired, or certainly relieved of their positions, because Mr. Buhari will be keen to bring his own strategy in and his own team to tackle this burning insecurity in the northeast.
Not least because he's a soldier by background.
He's a general. He's got to put his own people there.
Absolutely. So he knows, and he tells us he's learned his lessons, so he knows what works in Nigeria and what doesn't work. So yeah, that clean-up, flush-out system, I think, needs to happen, not just within the army, by the way. There are many other elements that need to be washed out and cleaned out. There'll be a lot of nervous people with change of governments. There's always that nervousness. What about my post? What happens to this and what happens to that? I'll have to say, though, I've been a little disappointed that the Buhari camp looks very male-dominated. It looks very macho. Very few women circling around that. And we know that in Africa we've got a lot of women in parliaments. Rwanda does very well with that, and many other countries do very well.
Actually, Jonathan did very well with that, let's face it.
It does, but we're not seeing enough, Charles. We're not seeing enough women up there representing the key issues which matter. Men represent women on issues that are so critical to women.
Absolutely. And of course, the other big issue, Warwick, is poverty. A lot of it in the northeast and the north where he comes from. But the question, of course, is how can you alleviate poverty and create jobs with such an enormous electricity pinch and crumbling infrastructure?
That's a question that he's going to have to find an answer to, and it's going to be part of, I think, an employment strategy that has to be evolved against the realities that exist on the ground.
Well, he promised to create 2 million jobs. You know,
to do it, or even come close to it. You can't create jobs out of a vacuum. What is the activity that is going to employ those new job seekers?
On that note, for the moment, Dr. Warwick Onyeama and Dorcas Gwata, thank you very much indeed.